Thank you, Chairman Chivukula. And one thing Chairman did not mention is that I most recently, before coming to Maryland, worked in New Jersey and worked closely with the legislature. So it's really a privilege for me to be here with all of you. And I know that this is really running over quite a bit. And so I'm going to try to actually avoid some of my slides so that hopefully we can get some questions, because a lot of information has been covered. But what I really wanted to touch on, first of all, I was really invited in my role at Princeton, which I had the opportunity and privilege to serve at for about 9 months last year by Bryden, to talk about some of the research that I worked on with some faculty and students there. And so I'm going to touch on that, and it relates to evaluation of distributed energy. But I also, and now that I'm in this new role in Maryland, wanted to just give you guys a little teaser of some of the exciting things going on in Maryland, because I think there's some really interesting developments there that might be useful to you in your states. So let me just touch on some of this, and then certainly we can talk through the questions and answers. What I think you've heard so far is, if you look at it from sort of the bulk power and the transmission side, there's a whole nother element which really falls to the states, which is the distribution system. And you do not have to look far. Almost every day there's articles now, there were 2 in the Wall Street Journal just the other day, about some of the challenges with the distribution system, many of which we felt on the reliability side, certainly in New Jersey, also in Maryland, with some of the storms in the last few years, and a real focus that people are now questioning: how should we improve resiliency, improve reliability? And one of the things that I'm very interested in, both from the research that I did and now in my role as a commissioner, is to make sure that as we approach this, which are all going to be extremely expensive undertakings to strengthen the grid or improve resiliency, and you've heard we have a lot to do on other elements of the whole power system, that we do it in a smart way, and that we think about the technological opportunities that we have now, which are really quite exciting, but they're also very disruptive. And so, as I was looking through this, and I do have slides, I have to put my glasses on, which I guess you can get access to, because I'm not going to really go through them for you. But what's interesting to me is, if you go back, and I know you're all having some sessions on federalism later today, and look at the Energy Policy Act, the Federal Energy Policy Act in 2005, at that time, it was already, identified that what they called distributed generation could play an important role as we were trying to improve things like system reliability, reduction of peak power requirements, which really add a lot of expense to consumers, improved infrastructure resilience, and vulnerability to terrorism. These are the same things that we're talking about today, but this was back in 2005. And also coming out of it were, a number of studies that, have since come out of that, which have talked about other benefits besides resiliency and reliability that relate to greenhouse gas and other emissions, fuel price hedges. You had a talk this morning about over-reliance on certain types of, wanting to make sure we had a diversity of sources of energy. Reduce transmission and distribution losses, this connection, right, between when we're going to have to make investments in large transmission systems, which I know AEP would love to do, but there's alternatives and there's trade-offs that you can look at. And I think that policymakers really need to take this opportunity to look at the whole spectrum and to understand how the distribution, transmission, and generation sectors work together. Now, with distributed energy, and this gets to some of the work that we did at Princeton, certainly there are challenges that come with that. There's the opportunities I just talked about, but some of the challenges, have to do with concerns on intermittency. These are the concerns you'll hear about with wind, with solar, the lack of storage, although we're certainly seeing some advances in battery technology. One of the big challenges right now is inconsistent valuation and regulatory incentives. How do we actually compensate providers in a more distributed system? We have a long history of how we have compensated centralized generation and also more centralized transmission. And in fact, that's one of my new roles. I'll be overseeing rate cases, large rate cases. We know how to do that. We have a little more difficulty figuring out the right way to compensate for many, many more providers who are not in this traditional system. Lots of questions on interconnection, safety, and dispatch. And then increasingly you will hear issues, and certainly people in the state, at the state level, consumer advocates and others, will hear issues of people who are in the system and of people who are not in the system. So as you get more people coming off the grid, who's going to pay for the remaining grid? How is this transfer going to take place? And what are we going to do to make sure that equity is involved in that? I'm going to skip over this, but some very interesting issues that came out of a law called PURPO, which was really back in 2005 again, trying to encourage states to look at different mechanisms that would enable the development of more distributed sources of energy. And some of that now is taking place, and I'll touch on that in Maryland because we are using a number of those mechanisms. So anyway, about Princeton and why I think Bryden invited me here, what we looked at, and I did this with a colleague from Columbia University, was we were seeing around the country a lot of controversy on the issue of what they call net metering, which those of you who are not like really into the energy world, maybe haven't focused on that, but you'll hear about it because it's popping up everywhere. And this was really the initial approach that was used to try to enable folks who were putting solar energy on their homes or businesses, and didn't need to use all of it because, right, we don't have storage at this point. So you can use energy as it's developed, but then you've got to do something with it. So net metering allows folks who have solar energy systems to use what they can, and then if there's excess, to essentially send it back into the grid and to then take from the grid, use the balance of the amount that they need, and then depending on the state, there's different rules for how they get compensated or not for any kind of excess. And net metering is really something that's been critical, I would say, for enabling the development we've had in certain states. New Jersey, I think, is second or third. California has a robust net metering program. Maryland has one. And I think there are at least 25 or 30 states that have net metering. It's been, I would say, something that's been critical to start, but as you get further along in the amount of solar energy that come on to systems, it could best be, I think, categorized as something of a sort of rough justice. It's a simple way to do this because we haven't figured out how to compensate or measure, and that's where we're starting to hear a lot of complaints. The utilities believe they're being underpaid, and that net metering, and this is a generalization, but this is what we've heard, underpaid, and that this is going to create a lot of burdens on the system, and the solar generators and the new solar companies believe that they're being underpaid. And so sometimes in politics you think, well, if everybody's unhappy, maybe we're doing something right, but my sense is that maybe we should try to figure out, particularly as you get to certain levels of concentration or development of this energy source, to really start thinking about how could we do this more accurately. We certainly have the tools. We know how to measure. We have plenty of engineers and finance people in the energy industry. We should be able to figure this out. So what we did is we pulled together a roundtable, and I have a report that I'd be happy to share with anyone who's interested, of really some of the leaders in this area. We had the chairman of FERC. We had chairman of public utility commissions in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. We have the CEO of Solar City, the CEO of a kind of new energy efficiency behavioral group called O-Power. We had the CEO of two utilities, some environmental organizations, consumer activists. There were 30 folks and some academics from Columbia and Princeton. And they spent the day together trying to look at how should we be thinking about valuation, and did not come to any consensus, and we didn't try to, but it was very helpful to have folks together. And this was one of the charts that my co-author and I worked together with the folks on, just to try to say, let's see if we could at least identify what the key issues are. If you were to create a valuation system that was not this rough justice, what are the kind of things that you would want to take into account if you are a legislator, if you are a regulator? And what we came up with, and again, there was we didn't attempt consensus, and I would not say there was, is that there's certain areas that folks have to start thinking about. One is just the value of the energy that you're going to get. The other is the value of what we call capacity, which is a whole nother lecture, but is very, very valuable, and we spend a lot of money on as ratepayers. And then we have an area we call pecuniary costs, which was just this idea that that when you have distributed generation, it is putting some costs on the system. And this is what you will hear about from utilities, that it's gonna cost us to have some firming backup energy in case it's not there. It's gonna cost us to figure out how to cover the remaining infrastructure as people come off. But then there's a lot of benefits that they're not getting identified, that they haven't really been compensated for either. Maybe we don't need as many transmission lines in the future, right? Maybe we don't need to fortify as many distribution lines in the future, or maybe they've got to be different ones. So how do we think about that? What are those possible benefits? Line loss, I was really excited to hear some of the work that you're doing, because so much energy is lost just in the transmission and distribution of that electricity. So the closer you are to using it, right, it doesn't have to travel, and there's potentially a benefit there. Merit order effect really applies more in things like in these competitive markets that you heard about earlier, PJM for the one that we're in. People are paying a price based on a capacity market and a sort of a market clearing price, that if you reduced demand at certain times during the day, everybody will benefit. And that can be a very, very significant consumer benefit. And just trying to get the value of that can be quite valuable. So those are the kind of things. And then the really controversial one comes to, what do you do with externalities? Like, you can handle those ones I talked about, which are really in the system. But externalities are things that people will argue on either side. And I think this is really where legislators need to get involved, honestly, because it's a real policy call. Do we want to put a value on a local environmental benefit? If you could have solar generation versus, there was talk earlier about a coal plant, right, versus something that was going to emit more environmental impacts. Is there a value to that? Can you measure it? And how would you compensate for that? Same thing with greenhouse gases. That was certainly a hot topic, literally. Energy security, that we talked about. One of the things that came up after Sandy is that there were lots of people who were running out and buying diesel generators, which to me was kind of a travesty, honestly. I mean, I think, if we want to go towards having a distributed resource, let's take the opportunity here and find the ones that are the best, most economical, cleanest, and most efficient, knowing the technology we have, and do it in a way that's, going to fortify the system. But lots of people who had the means are now going out and trying to take care of it themselves. So those externalities are things that really are a policy call. I think with that, the only thing I want to tell you about Maryland, because I've only been there 2 weeks, is that it's really quite exciting. And we have a governor who's very committed and interested in all these topics. But one certainly is Maryland was hit very hard with this storm called the derecho a couple of years ago that's talked about almost every day. And so out of that, the commission did come up with some very detailed reliability rules that all of the utilities are having to comply with and file reports on. And so those are things that, as a commissioner, I'll be looking at the reports and reviewing with the staff and with the utilities, but it may be a model for some of you who are looking at that. They seem to have moved on that quite quickly. And the other is that distributed energy is playing a role in Maryland. And you can see, if you want copies of my slides, we can go into it. But they have had extensive AMI implementation in the state. And by the end of 2014, I think they're going to be almost 100%, except for one small utility, implemented. So because of that, we're now in the process of having quite a number of trials of different types of financing or pricing. So dynamic pricing, giving customers incentives if they will turn their AC off, giving customers incentives on both real time of use. Pretty interesting, and we are actually going to have a hearing in a couple of weeks where we'll be reviewing the first two quarters of 2012. Every year, the State Energy Authority has to come to the commission and show us what the benefits have been, what the costs have been, and very detailed cost-benefit analysis. So again, maybe a good model for any of you who have had AMI rollouts or are looking at AMI rollouts to see what some of the cost benefits are. And then on the energy efficiency side, some interesting things going on. I mentioned O-Power earlier. There's other groups like that popping up around the country which are looking at behavioral incentives. These have also, a couple of the utilities in Maryland have taken those on, and we will be evaluating that.